The White House wants to shift disaster response to the states and route recovery funds directly through the White House. Trump says each state should be able to handle this.
A lot of places in the United States that could be affected if FEMA is no longer stepping in. This video is not about fear or politics whatsoever. It's about being ready and realistic, because whether you're a homeowner or a buyer or just someone living in the United States in a high-risk area, you're going to want to know what's coming, because that's going to give you a chance to protect your home, your finances, your future, and your family. So let's talk about what's happening. There's a proposal to reduce the federal government's involvement in disaster response, with FEMA essentially taking a step back. The idea is that states could manage recovery more directly, possibly faster, maybe even more efficiently. And so in the past few months, FEMA has already pulled back over $600 million in mitigation grants. There's been staffing cuts, slow deployments, and states already being told to prepare for what's possibly coming next. And so this is essentially not a theory anymore. It's already happening, and it's starting to affect how communities prepare and recover. The bigger question, of course, is, how does this phasing out going to look like? Is FEMA going to get completely dismantled, or are there parts of FEMA still going to be activated? We're going to talk much more of the worst case scenario so that you're most prepared. First, talk about what FEMA really does, because I think a lot of people don't understand the involvement that FEMA does have when there's a natural disaster. It's way more than just sandbags and giving out bottled water. FEMA is part of the backbone of recovery after disaster. Think of it like the financial and logistical muscle that helps communities rebuild, essentially. Here are some of the obvious things that FEMA actually provides: emergency housing and shelter, rebuilding grants and home repair assistance for those people who need it, the National Flood Insurance Program, which at this point insures roughly 4.7 million properties. It can also provide low interest loans to homeowners and small businesses that really need it in order to upgrade their homes to reduce future risk, like elevating roads or strengthening drainages. But here are some things that people don't actually realize that FEMA does. So for example, they've done hazard mapping, so cities actually know which areas are most at risk. As a matter of fact, just last year, FEMA updated quite a lot of flood maps across the United States. They also support temporary schools and facilities so that kids can get back to class even if their school is gone. They help coordinate debris removal, which can be incredibly costly. They help fund local emergency workers and utility crews when disaster recovery stretches on and budgets run thin, like it can often do. So let me just give you a more concrete example just to really kind of make this come alive in terms of what FEMA does. After Hurricane Ian hit just a few years ago, I met Rosa, a single mom in Fort Myers, and her roof was ripped off completely. So how did FEMA step in? Well, FEMA provided her with temporary housing. They also gave her a grant to fix the roof. And who knows? I mean, if she didn't have help through FEMA, she was running short of money. It's, very feasible to believe that she might have ended up living in her car during the time that her home was being repaired, because she didn't have anybody around her that could help her otherwise. And this example is actually not an outlier, and that's typically what FEMA does at scale after every major disaster across the United States. Now look, by no means is FEMA perfect, and last year it's actually gotten a lot of bad publicity via social media, headlines, and FEMA had a lot of work to do last year. We had 2 hurricanes and Tropical Storm Debbie that basically pounded the area over a very short period of time. And so it gotten to the point where people were complaining that they called FEMA and they never got anybody on the phone, or maybe they had to wait over an hour before they actually were able to talk to somebody. There were also conspiracy theories in relation especially to certain communities having been ignored, and that just hasn't held true. There's no evidence that's really the case. But the fact is that it's that kind of confusion and inconsistency that has led to calls for reform. But by now it's changed to something way bigger than just getting reformed. At this point, the question really is, what if FEMA's role is dramatically reduced or maybe even eliminated entirely. I think the effects would be massive, especially on the housing market. Let's talk about what would become a challenge. So right now, FEMA manages the NFIP, which is the National Flood Insurance Program. And so without it, if that's no longer available to people, then really the only option is private insurance, right? But if insurance is so much more expensive, or let's just say it's almost impossible to get, especially somebody that has a mortgage, where mortgage companies are going to require that the person get an insurance, but now there are no insurance carriers offering insurance in a specific location. Well, we'll do that to the housing prices. It'll push it down because there's going to be less buyers able to purchase a particular home. Let's actually get into a much more state-specific example. And of course, I'm going to choose Florida because I live here. And yes, we're used to a lot of storms. And because of that reason, Florida is very well prepared. In 2024, FEMA provided over $2.1 billion in disaster relief to Florida still, right? Even though we're very prepared, we're still getting a lot of assistance from FEMA. That included grants to individuals, to local governments, and infrastructure recovery. Now, if you take FEMA out of the way, you take it out of the picture, the state has to close that gap somehow. Where is Florida going to come up with $1.2 billion or $2 billion, depending on what the needs are, and that's going to depend on the year and of course how many hurricanes we've had. And essentially there's really no easy way to do it, and it might consist of several different strategies. But Florida would likely need to increase property taxes, especially in high-risk coastal zones, perhaps raise sales taxes, which would affect pretty much everyone, residents and tourists, perhaps relocate funds from things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and perhaps also tap into state emergency reserves, which might not last through multiple storms. And then let's not forget that the state would also need to rebuild FEMA's programs, things like debris cleanup, housing assistance, emergency logistics, even some insurance support that would have to be added in besides filling the gap, the monetary gap. Now, what would happen to the housing market? How would it look like if FEMA steps back? Now, let me be clear, this is going to be the worst case scenario, but it's also a realistic one if the worst case scenario actually came true. I believe that inland, safer areas would likely see a price spike because a lot of folks are going to want to lessen the exposure, their risk, and they're going to move further away from the coast, especially if it's going to be much easier to get homeowners insurance or flood insurance. There's also going to be fewer restrictions, possibly living in low-risk areas. High-risk zones, floodplains, coastal areas, wildfire-prone towns, if you're maybe in California, they could see values drop fast, especially if there's no opportunity more of getting insurance. Mortgages in those zones are going to be much harder to secure if insurance carriers are going to drop out. The harder it gets to get insurance, the more expensive it becomes to get insurance, the likelier it is it's going to distract people, and it's going to push people into other areas where it's going to provide them with much more low-cost opportunities to owning a home. And builders may stop building in areas that are higher risk because if buyers can't get insurance, they can't get loans, then the builder can't sell. Now, I'm not trying to say that the wealthy are the only ones that are going to survive this shift. I mean, the working class also, and families, but they're going to be really smart in terms of where they're going to be moving to, where they're going to be purchasing their next home, and many are going to move much more inland. And so when it comes to kind of understanding how this is going to shift the housing market, I think there's going to be clear winners and losers when it comes to location. Now, having said all of this, let's actually bring it back to you. What can you do right now to safeguard your home and your future? First off, what you're going to want to do is get the right insurance. Even if your lender doesn't require it, get flood insurance. Hands down, I tell everybody in Florida, it doesn't matter if you're in a flood zone or not, get flood insurance, especially after Tropical Storm Debbie last year. We've seen some homes flood that were actually in a flood zone X, which is the preferred flood zone here in Florida. That's actually supported by data that indicates that 1 in 4 flood claims come from outside high-risk zones. And so what you're also going to want to do is ask your agent what disasters am I actually covered for? You're going to want to add loss of use coverage so you're not stuck paying rent and mortgage at the same time if you're displaced, because you just don't know how much FEMA is going to support you in the future, if there's even a FEMA. You're going to want to build a cash cushion. So FEMA often bridges the gap with emergency grants or low interest loans, but if that's no longer available to you, you might need to cover short-term costs yourself. Even $3,000, $5,000 saved can make a huge difference if you need it during a time of crisis. If you own a home in Florida and it's not wind rated, it doesn't have wind rated roof, it doesn't have hurricane shutters or impact resistant windows, then I suggest, if it's in your budget, get those upgraded. It'll make it much easier to insure your home, and you might actually get a premium discount. And this is really important. Understand where the nearest shelter is and what documents you need in order to evacuate. And if there's a catastrophe, if there's a natural disaster and they're asking to evacuate, evacuate. Get out of the zone that's been asked to evacuate. And what happens is, if you actually stay in one of those evacuation zones that have been asked to leave, and you call for help, they don't need to come and rescue you. And this goes without saying, you're gonna wanna document everything, take photos. This is really for insurance policies. So take photos from before, and God forbid something happens, you're gonna wanna take photos afterwards, store it away, and then have it readily available for insurance purposes. Key here is you're gonna wanna be prepared no matter whether FEMA is around or not. Now, I have a question for you. Would you purchase a home in a flood zone that had no FEMA support? Do me a favor, leave a comment in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this video, if it made you think, please give it a like. Also, share it with a friend. If you're new to my channel and you haven't subscribed yet, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe. Thank you so much for stopping in today. This was my take today. I wish you all a great day.